Yo, yo, what's going on, guys? Hope everybody's having a great day today. In today's video, we're going to be talking about React interview questions, more of the technical side of things. So, whenever you have a technical interview, you might have to code out a solution to show your knowledge on React. And sometimes that could be a little nerve-wracking based on like how complex the problem is, how everybody's just watched you code, and some people fold under that pressure and they feel like because they're under like at least an hour or 30 minutes depending on how long the technical interview is, that you have to hurry up and code a solution. A technical interview is only to showcase what you know and whether you are knowledgeable of the fundamentals and the key concepts of React. If you understand the fundamentals, I'm telling you will get a job. Whether you're going on YouTube looking at tutorials or working through your old coding problems, the most you'll learn is on the job for sure. Okay. So don't get it into your head about just overthinking and complicating how to solve a problem. The way you go about it is actually reading what the problem is and what the potential solution is also. Okay. So here we're gonna be going through three tiers, and I'm gonna create a video series on this on different levels of React questions depending on what job you're trying to go for. All right. So if there's any entry level jobs, and I know that's pretty tough right now, but I have it as entry level, junior level, and senior level. And each video will cover each individual level. So today we're going to be talking about entry level, and we have 4 questions to get through. All right. So I'm going to show you how you should be looking at a question, how you should dissect it to figure out what the solution is. And if you know the fundamentals of React, you should be fine. But if you're still trying to learn, please take your time, take notes, slow it down to where you can understand what I'm saying. Because I'm going to go pretty slow in terms of solving the problem, but if you need that extra time, please do so. All right. So let me get into like the 4 questions that we're going to be talking about today. So the 4 questions that I have here is create a simple counter component. It'll start from 0 and then we'll add 1 on every button click. And then there's also a button to decrement or subtract from that count. The next thing is conditional rendering. And simple list rendering, it's just basically you have a list of data that you want to render to the browser. How do you go about iterating through each individual item in that array to display that information? It's very simple to do, but a lot of people mess up on this. I personally messed up on this on one interview that I did a long time ago, and it was a super simple problem. So if I would have known the fundamentals of how to do that, and then also when it comes to listing out items within an array, why a key is so important, I would have probably moved on to the next round, but it is what it is. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about today is basic form input. Now, some of these applications that are out there today rely heavily on forms. Think about someone logging into an application. That is a form. So you need to understand the basics of how to use forms using state in React, how to capture the event of whenever a user is typing in to that input field, how do you validate the data and all that stuff. But for this particular problem, all we're going to be focusing on is the basic form input. Do you know how to set up a form input, a text input? If you know how to do that, you should be golden, all right? So that's in a nutshell what we're going to be working on today. And I'm going to show you a couple things that, based on these problems, like how to dissect it, how to figure out what is needed, what's not needed, and just go about writing out a solution. Now, you might get one of these questions. This problem right here is the most common, but just being prepared for different scenarios is going to set you up for success. Look at it as like prep for just in case this could happen. So let's dive into the code real quick. In this example, I have all of my components, right? And what I failed to mention here is that for each of these drop downs, I have the solution here. So the solution is basically rendering out the component that we see in the code. So if I go back here, you can see I have all of these different components, and these are being rendered to the browser right now. So say, for example, if I was to change this to 1, 2, 3, 4, and I go back into my app, 1, 2, 3, 4 is there. So this is working fine. All we have to do is code out a solution and we should be good to go. So the first problem that we're going to be solving here is create that simple counter component. Now, Let's dissect the problem. What is the problem? We want to create a component, a counter component, right? That displays a number and increments or decrements depending on the button click. All right. Pretty self-explanatory. So you have to display the count. That's number one. So how would you go about doing that? You have to create a button element that anytime I click on it is going to append to the current state of that value for the counter. So the initial state should be 0. And then if I click on the decrement, it should subtract 1 every single time. So I'm going to show you the easy way to do it. And then if you want some brownie points so that the initial value stays at 0, how to go about solving that problem. So the first thing that we want to do, we want to initialize our state. So we need a value that's initialized at 0, right? I'm going to create my state. And when you're using functional components, this is how you write things out. Some companies still use class-based components. This is, for this example, I'm not doing that, okay? Functional is the way to go. It's just easier to read. There's not a lot of boilerplate that you have to set up, and you can actually understand what's going on within your application. So here I have my count. It's set to 0, and we're using TypeScript, and I want you guys to get used to using TypeScript. So I'm going to set this as a number. This tells me that this value will always be a number. If it's a string, TypeScript, well, the application will yell at me and be like, hey, this is the wrong type. Are you sure this is supposed to be a string or a number? Okay. So always type out what the data is going to be. Now that we have this already set up, the next thing that we need to do is display the current count. All right. So how do we go about doing that? So we have this initial div here. I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to add an h2 tag and I'm going to type out counter. And here we use JSX. So JSX is explicitly used in React and it allows you to use state, current functions, or the values that you want to display. You could do it conditionally and all that stuff. So here I already have my count, which is state, right? And this should be 0. All right. So when I go back into my app, you could see the counter is 0. This is correct. So if I come back here and I set it to 4, for example, you can see the counter is 4 now. So this tells us that the count or the state is going to be correct. Either way, once we're calling this out. Now we could create 2 button HTML elements, right? And what's cool about this is that I have AI that shows me like exactly what it knows exactly based on the comment that you see here, what the next steps are going to be. You won't have this on a technical interview. This just makes it super easy for me to just write this out so that we're not spending like almost an hour of me typing this out. So here you can see that the increment of this, we're adding +1. We're satisfying this requirement. We need to create a button that has a plus in it and it should add 1 to the value. So if I go back to my app, you can see that I have this button here already laid out. When I click on it, it adds 1 to each individual click. Perfect. Now, when I go back to my code, how do I go about subtracting it? You just take a copy of this and then you paste it in. And instead of +1, -1. Now that satisfied this requirement to decrement, right? So now that we got that set up, let's go back into our example and, oh, made a typo. Let me go back. So this should be minus, right? Go back. Now we have a plus and a minus, right? And then we can subtract from that. And it goes back to 0, right? So we could plus, minus. Now, in this example, there's nothing stopping us from subtracting from 0. If we want the initial value to be 0, we need to do something about that, right? So if I click this, see what happens. It becomes negative, right? And now I have to hit the plus to get back to that initial count. So how do we go about solving this problem? And it's very simple, all right? So watch what I'm doing. Take some notes. So check this out. What I want to do here is actually when the initial value is 0, I want to disable the decrement button. And I like to keep things very clear and concise. So I'm going to add increment and decrement to these buttons so that it's super clear to the user exactly what the functionality will be. All right. So you have to be very explicit when you're writing out your components and making sure that at least the information that you're adding to a button or to a div, it makes sense to the user. That's very important. If it's super confusing, we're going to have a problem. If I go back to my app, look, the changes are there, right? Now watch this. How do we go about solving the problem where we want the initial value to always be 0 as soon as we get to 0 when we're adding and subtracting? The easiest way to do this is to disable it, and we could do count equals 0. So when the count equals to 0, the button should stay disabled. When I add a 1 to it, it should be enabled so that I can subtract 1 from that value. So look at this. If I do this and then I hit decrement again, what do you think is going to happen? This button's going to be disabled. I can't click it. I can't do anything, right? It's disabled in the browser. If I click 1, that's it. This satisfies this problem. Very, very simple. One bonus thing I'm going to show you guys, and if you want to deal with props too, I want to give you guys like the game here. All right, because I had to learn how to deal with props, how to destructure all that stuff. I'm going to show you how to pass in properties to a common button component, and this will essentially take in an on-click event and a title for that button, so you can name it to whatever you want. And this is going to give you the fundamentals of how properties work. So how do we create a common button component that we can use within our app? Within this folder, I'm going to create a common folder. And this basically tells us that these are the common components that's going to be reusable in our application that we can use anywhere in our app. So here in this folder, I'm going to create a button.tsx component. And what we need to do, and here's a shortcut too, if you want to create a component relatively easily without having to copy and paste from different components, check this out. In VS Code, you're able to do this. So there's different keywords that you can use to create the component styles that you want. So if you type in RFCE, that will create a React functional export component. Okay. Um, there are other ones that if you want to do an arrow function, if you want to do a component with prop types, all that stuff is already baked into this, but I like to use RFCE. And that will create my button component. Relatively simple. All right. So you don't have to go about setting all this stuff up. It will just work out the box. So here, I'm going to pass in that button component. So this will be button, right? And that's all it's going to be, just this. Now, if I use this within my app, I could then export this from the common folder. And now we have a reusable component. So if I go back here, you can see that, look, I got my button here, right? Cool. So how do we pass in properties to this button component? The way we're going to do this, we're going to do this from this page, and then I'm going to go back to the button component and show you guys how to pass in properties and also type safe it so that you understand exactly what properties that you're passing into that button, so there's no confusion. So here we want an on-click event, right? The same thing here. And we're going to pass in the set count plus 1, which is a function. Then the title of this button will be plus increment. So because we did that, now we have this reusable component that takes in the property of an on-click event and a title. The same thing here, but now it's in the reusable button format. Also, we want to pass in a disabled prop to tell us whether this is true or false, right? So disabled, you can do disabled like this, and this will be a Boolean value. Let's go back into our button and pass in those properties. Now with TypeScript, you have to type this out. So I'm going to show you guys how to do this. So you would do interface, button props. So this is all the properties that we're passing into our button. You would do the onClick, which will be a function, and we're returning nothing. Then here we would do a disabled, which will be a Boolean value. What the question mark tells us is either you're going to pass in that prop. It's not required. And then the title, what is the title? Is it going to be a number or a string, right? It's a string. So here, I want to destructure. Now you could do, for example, props and button props, right? I don't like having that keyword around. So I'm trying to get you guys used to destructuring your props so you know exactly what's being passed in and making sure that is in a good, clean format so you could read the code and understand what properties are doing what and trace back if there's any issues, trace back from this component back to your main component and figure out what's going on. So here I destructured my onClick disabled and title property and is using the type of button props. Now, when I add in these properties, I'm gonna do the same thing that was in the previous example, right? OnClick is gonna use the OnClick function. Disabled is gonna have the disable property. And then instead of having button here, all we need is the title of this. So now, when I go back to my app, check this out. And we want actually to remove this disable from increment. And I want to do the same thing for this guy and make this decrement, right? So this will have a -1, this will have a minus, and then also we want to pass in our disabled prop because we want the decrement button to be disabled and it will take in the count. So now we have two reusable button components that have different functionality. So when I go back into my app now, you can see that now the buttons, they're on top of each other because it's within a div. We could easily fix that just by going back to our code and removing the div. And now when I go back here to our app, look at this. Everything's there. So now when I click on plus, it adds +1 to every initial state. And when I go back here, disable. This is just a basic example of how to use props within your application and how to type that out effectively. All right. So we already solved problem number one. Pretty straightforward. Problem number two, conditional rendering. Now we want to create a component that shows and hides content based on the Boolean state. This could be whether this is true or false. You could say, is the content hidden right now? That's obviously going to be false. That's default. When you click on the button, it should change the state to true. Let me flip back to the code. Because we have that button component, it's going to be really easy for us to reuse that. I'm going to create a state called is visible, and is visible is going to tell us whether the content that we're going to be rendering is viewable or not. The default value will be false because we're not hiding it. First thing that we need to do, because we have this in a div, we want to add the button component, and we're going to do a on click, which will set the state to, the reverse of visible is visible, which is false. So this will do the opposite. It will be true on each individual click. Here, we're actually looking at, okay, well, if it's true, then we're going to hide the content. If it's false, we're going to show the content. And then here, what we want to do is create an H3. And in this H3, we're going to say, all right, if this is visible, then we're going to show content is visible. If it's hidden, then we could say content is hidden, just to kind of give you like that boilerplate of how to hide and show information on a page dynamically. All right. So if I go back into our app, this is essentially already done for us, right? So if I go here and then I click on show content, it changes. If I click on, so content is hidden by default, right? So the content is already hidden. So if I click on show, it should show it, right? And you get this nice little effect here. And that's it. That's as simple as it can be. Now, when it comes to just writing this out, you can make it more dynamic to where you could, for example, you could use this for like tabs on a page. So if you click on an individual tab, how do you want to render that content within that tab? because what could happen essentially, the more information that you show on the tabs and you're not hiding them dynamically, you could run into potential performance issues. So I want you guys to be aware of how you display that information. The way we're doing it here, we're doing it conditionally, right? So only this content will show and be rendered to the browser if the value of this Boolean changes. So you have to understand these basic fundamentals. Now let's go back to our app and start solving for the third problem. We need to render a list of items with proper React keys. This is very important. This is the fundamental that gets every single developer out there. Doesn't matter what level you are. It's just an oversight. Now, if you have a lot of data that you're rendering to the page that you're trying to update and you don't have the right React keys in there, you're going to run into a lot of conflicts and you're not going to understand what's going on. It's usually the React keys that you're sending to a list. So I'm going to show you guys how to dynamically set that up to where you make it super unique. You're able to update or delete information from that list whenever you see fit. So all we need to do is display the array of fruits, right? Apple, banana, orange, very simple. Each item needs to be its own list element, okay? And I'm going to show you how to set that up. And then also, what are the proper keys? You got to use proper keys. So let's dive in. We already have our fruits array here. The easiest way to list out each individual fruit within a React application is first you need to initialize a unordered list, which is an HTML element. And here, we're going to use ES6 syntax to then map over the data in that array to then create a list item for each individual item. We initialize our fruits array and we're going to use dot map. This is going to map over every single value in the array and is going to generate an HTML element on the page. I have my fruit and I have my index. And then for each individual list item, I'm going to display the fruit and then also the index, the key. And I'm going to show you how to make this unique because using this method, you're going to run into problems. It's not unique enough, all right? Because especially if you're rendering multiple lists or multiple components that's going to be using the same key, 0 on one list versus the other, React's going to get confused. So we go back to our app, you can see, okay, we satisfied this requirement. I think there's a typo in the code and I could take care of this, but we satisfied with that requirement, right? We took care of this, we took care of this. We need to take care of this pronto. All right. So if I go back to our app, how do we make the key unique to this? You would do backticks here. And now I'm in ES6 land. So I could do the fruit, which is a string, dash, $, which allows us within this ES6 syntax, when you use a $, that allows you to just pull in data from a JavaScript function and all that stuff. So here, I'll just type in index. And then this is going to display for the key, the name of the fruit dash the index. So now we have our custom key here that's going to help us or help React understand, okay, this is unique to this list. If I go back to our app now, you can see that we still have apple, banana, orange. Say, for example, if I wanted to add another fruit, we're going to call it grape, or I got two more, grapes, mango. That's about it for now. AI is getting crazy. And I want to display that list. Like, what's going to happen? Like, are we going to get a duplicated list or not? When we go back to the app, look what happens. Apple, banana, orange, grapes, mango. And each individual list in this view has its own key. So this is very important. You guys need to make sure whenever you're iterating over stuff, have a unique key. Fundamentals, bro. So we solved problem number 3. And then the last problem that we're going to solve today, the last problem, is a basic form input. How do we create a form input, and also how do we use it in React so it's controlled? So first we need to do is create a text input field. Then we need to display what the actual input value is below the input. So the same examples that we went through before, you should already get an idea of how we're going to be doing this. And then also, how is it controlled by React state? I'm going to go to my form input. You already see the problem here. We already dissected it on the app. So how do we do that? First things first, we're just going to create a state, and this will just be the input value, and it will just be an empty string. And I actually want to type this out so we know that this will always be a string. And here I want to create an input element. So the first thing that I want to do is create a label for this input element, and I'm just going to call it, let's call it for like first name, just to be clear. So first name. Then our input will be type text, and I'll explain exactly what this is. The type will be text. You could change it to password. You could change it to anything that you want. Radio. It will change the way that the form input will display in the browser. The value here will be our initial state, which is an empty string. Okay, on change. So whenever the user is typing, we want to get the on change event because there's going to be a change, right? There's a key press. On each individual key press, we're going to get the value from the browser. So we're going to set our input value to the element, the target of that element. And then within that, based on the information that we're getting back from the browser, the value will be whatever the user input at that time is. I'm going to do a console log just to show you guys exactly what the input value is. So we go here, see that we have this not so pretty input field, right? It is what it is. And then what I'm going to do is actually open up developer tools in the browser. If you don't know what the shortcut is, it's F12 on your keyboard. There's a bunch of errors here. I think this is like input issues. We could take care of that. Let's just refresh this. We don't get anything. Good. All right. So if we go back to our console, we click on basic form input. Look what happens. Whenever I type, all that information is console logged out. So now we're using React State to keep record of what the user is typing in, even backspaces and all that stuff. The only problem that we're seeing here is like if you add a number, it's not supposed to be a number, but you could add validation steps to do that. And that's going to be in the next video. And I'll show you guys how to validate your input fields. But going back here, let's look at the requirements for this problem. There's a text input field that we took care of, right? We got that. Display the current input value below the input. We did not do this, but we did satisfy the last requirement, which is input should be controlled by React State. We did that. So going back to our example, how do we show the initial value of that state that we have here in the browser? Come on, bro. We already discussed it, man. We type out div, and you know what? I'm gonna make it an H3, and then I'm just gonna put current input value, and I'm gonna initialize my input value here. Just like we have the console log here, we could take care of that. Also, if you have any console logs while you're doing debugging, take that out. All right. You don't want your code littered with that. Now, if we go back to the app, look at here. Look at this. Perfect. We're doing exactly what we want here, right? Now, if you want to get some brownie points on styling, this is what you can do. The current input is below the input field and it's kind of squished together. Like I actually want to fix that. So how do we go about doing that? All you have to do, if you know HTML, you can inline style CSS within an HTML element. Within React, you have to encapsulate it into curly braces. And instead of doing like margin dash top, you're going to run into an error. It's like React doesn't like that because we're in JavaScript, right? So how do we solve that problem? We just do the previous example, margin top, it will translate that as margin top as CSS. And now you have this 20 pixels from the top. Now, when I go back here, I could type all this stuff out and it's very clear as to what's going on here. Same thing with the first name here. I'm just being nitpicky. I really don't like that. It's close to the input field. So I could do the same thing here. And then I'll do like margin right. Oh, well, yeah. Margin right 10 pixels. So this should move the margin from the label more to the right. And then the input field should have space in between. Okay. What is it yelling at me here? I need to add the style keyword And I just need to move this in. See, like the more you write code, you're gonna run into like these little gotchas here, and it's okay to make mistakes. It's not a big deal as long as you know exactly what you did wrong. And you look at the browser, and it'll tell you. I go back into my application. I should see 10 pixels to the right of the input field, and there should be a gap in between. And look, there it is. There it is. Perfect. So let's recap. Let's recap what we did. We went through all four of these problems and we dissected exactly how to solve that problem. You don't have to make it complicated. Just trust the fundamentals. If you know the fundamentals of React and how to write in it, and you've been working through building out applications and solving your own problems, you should be straightforward. Don't get into your head about being perfect on these coding problems. Just get to the meat and potatoes of solving the problem. And then if you have some time, just start to work on cleaning things up just to show that, yeah, I got the functionality is working now. I'm a big believer in functionality over form. I got the functionality going and you should be good to go. So, all right, guys, that's the video. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Be on the lookout for the junior level and senior level videos. It'll be coming out sometime this week and next week. And let me know if this video was helpful. Talk soon.